She pleaded because she was desperate, tired of the debt collectors at the door, tired of seeing her father's hands shake as he signed away their legacy, tired of pretending that a miracle would save them from the Icicle of England. "Take me instead of my father," Lydia cried, her voice raw, fracturing the frozen morning air. The sisters behind her didn't move. No one breathed. They watched as Lydia collapsed onto the jagged gravel, her lace-trimmed mauve sleeves staining with the dust of their ruin. No one believed the Duke would listen. Not really. Then the towering iron gates of Penhaligon Manor groaned open. The weeping of her family died slowly, like a candle running out of air. A man stepped through the threshold, tall, still, and draped in a dark, severe burgundy coat that made him look more like a shadow than a man. And he did not pause to look at the crumbling estate. He did not look amused by her tears. He looked straight at the girl on her knees. Lydia felt the world narrow to the space between her trembling hand and his polished boots. The Duke of Coldstream had arrived. Lydia felt the world narrow to the space between her trembling hand and his gloved grip. She had spent her life as a regular girl in the shadow of her family's name, invisible and safe. Now she was the center of a disaster. Benedict Ashcroft was a man of logic and iron, whispered about in drawing rooms and avoided by anyone seeking warmth. He did not want a wife, he wanted a business contract. He did not offer love, he offered honesty, protection, and a title that ensured no man could ever touch her again without consequence. As Lydia looked back at her stunned parents and weeping sisters, the truth hit her with terrible clarity. She wasn't just marrying a title, she was stepping into an unknown cage to buy their freedom. Her life had split into before and after, and as she stood to walk beside the man who had just bought her future, she had no idea which side would destroy her first. The iron gates stood as silent witnesses to a transaction that felt less like a betrothal and more like an execution. Lydia remained on the gravel, her breath hitching in the sudden, heavy silence that followed the Duke's chilling acceptance. The Icicle of England did not offer a hand to help her rise. Instead, he looked down at her with a terrifying, calculated focus, his shadow stretching long and dark across her dusty mauve silk. Behind her, in the row of her sisters, clad in their now faded yellows and blues, clutched at one another, their faces pale masks of horror. They watched in a paralysis of grief as their eldest sister was claimed not by a suitor, but by a creditor who dealt in lives rather than coin. Benedict Ashcroft stepped forward, the gravel crunching beneath his boots with the finality of a gavel. "Stand up, Lady Lydia," he commanded, his voice a low vibration of silk and steel that seemed to strip the warmth from the afternoon sun. "We shall not keep the vicar waiting for a debt this pressing." Lydia rose with a trembling strength, her knees aching from the stones. She did not look at her father, whose sharp eyes were now clouded with a coward's relief, nor at her mother, who stood rigid near the fountain, as if watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. She looked only at the Duke. His sharp, unreadable face remained a fortress of indifference, yet that predatory smile lingered at the corners of his mouth, a sign that he found her desperation steadying. The ceremony that followed in the dim, ancient chapel was a cold, hurried affair. There were no flowers, no celebratory hymns, only the scratch of a quill on a marriage license that felt like a death warrant. When it came time for the vows, the Duke's voice was steady and deep, echoing off the stone walls. "I will give you honesty and protection," he stated, his gray eyes locked onto hers like winter water. "In exchange, I require only your loyalty." Lydia's voice wavered as she spoke her oath, her heart thudding hard against her ribs. As he slipped the heavy gold band onto her finger, the metal felt like a shackle, cold and unyielding. The Duke lifted her hand, his gloved fingers surprisingly warm against her skin, and pressed a light, measured kiss upon her knuckles. It was a seal on a business contract, a final claim. As they walked out of the chapel, the carriage waited like a beast to carry her away to Coldstream Manor. Lydia knew with a terrible, shimmering clarity that she was no longer a daughter of the Penhaligons, but the duchess of a man who did not believe in love. The iron gates had closed, and with them, the world of frantic pleas and gravel-stained lace was replaced by a heavy, expectant quiet. Benedict Ashcroft did not lead Lydia toward the warmth of the drawing room, but rather deeper into the Penhaligon gardens, where the shadows of ancient oaks stretched like long, dark fingers over the manicured grass. He stopped near a stone wall smothered in pale roses, flowers that seemed too delicate for the man standing before them. He turned to face her, his sharp features illuminated by the slanting gold of the late afternoon sun, though his gray eyes remained as unyielding as a winter sea. "You are regretting it already," he stated, not as a question, but as a cold observation of the way she held her breath. "That is acceptable. Regret is the first stage of honesty." He did not reach for her hand, nor did he offer any comfort for the life she had just bartered away. Instead, he stood with his hands clasped behind his back, a silhouette of severe dark wool and uncompromising intent. "I have no need for the theater of romance, Lady Lydia. I do not seek a woman to pin flowers to my lapel or to whisper sweet lies into the night. I seek a partnership of utility." His voice was a low velvet rasp that carried the weight of a legal decree. "I require an heir to hold the Coldstream name, and I require a wife whose loyalty is beyond question. In return, the debt of your father is erased. You will have a title that acts as a shield, independence within my walls, and a life where no man may ever threaten your safety again." He paused, studying her face as if searching for a hidden clause in their contract. "But you must understand this clearly. There will be no illusions of affection. I offer you radical honesty, which is a far rarer coin than love." Lydia looked at the man who had just bought her future, his expression as unreadable as a locked vault. She thought of the merchant her father had chosen, a man whose touch felt like a stain, and then she looked at the Duke's steady, distant gaze. "You make it sound like a business arrangement," she whispered, her voice finally finding its footing in the cool air. "Because it is," he replied simply, "and in business, there is no room for the heartbreak of unmet expectations." She nodded once, the gold band on her finger catching the light as she accepted the cold silk of her new reality. He offered his arm again, his movement careful and measured. "Then we begin with the truth," he said, and together they walked back toward the noise of a world that had no idea she had just become a queen in a kingdom of ice. By the following morning, the events at the Penhaligon gates had spread through the town like a fever, infecting every drawing room and scullery with the venom of speculation. In an era where a woman's reputation was as fragile as fine porcelain, Lydia Penhaligon's name was being passed from lip to lip with a mixture of awe and sharp-edged malice. The morning of whispers had begun, and the air in the village was thick with the scent of scandal. Behind the closed shutters of tea rooms, the ton dissected the sacrifice of a regular girl, one with no extraordinary dowry or staggering beauty, who had somehow snared the most formidable bachelor in England. At the local inn, gentlemen lowered their newspapers to discuss the Duke's shocking smile, a phenomenon as rare and unsettling as a comet in a black sky. They spoke of the debt, of the Penhaligon ruin, and of the girl who had cast herself into the dirt to buy her father's life. Meanwhile, in the sun-drenched breakfast parlors of the gentry, the women were less kind. They wondered aloud if Lydia had practiced some dark rustic magic to summon the Icicle of England to her doorstep. To them, it was a disaster disguised as a miracle. A commoner had ascended to a throne of ice, and they could not forgive her for the audacity of her survival. Inside the Penhaligon household, the atmosphere was no less strained. Servants hurried through the hallways with averted eyes, their footsteps echoing the frantic heartbeat of a house under siege. Lydia sat at the dining table, her fingers tracing the lace of her mauve sleeves, now cleaned of the garden's dust, but still carrying the memory of the Duke's heavy shadow. Her mother paced the floor, her silk skirts swishing like an approaching storm, while her father stared into his tea as if the dregs could explain the Duke's sudden mercy. What the world outside was a chorus of judgment, each whisper adding a brick to the wall that now separated Lydia from her former life. She was no longer just a daughter or a sister. She was a curiosity, a debtor, and a future duchess. As the sun climbed higher, casting long, sharp shadows through the windows, Lydia realized that the town was not merely wondering how she had captured the Duke. They were waiting, with bated breath and sharpened tongues, to see exactly how long it would take for the coldest Duke in England to break her. The carriage slowed to a crawl as the heavy iron wheels crunched over the deep, frost-bitten gravel of the main drive. Coldstream Manor did not emerge from the mist so much as it loomed over it, a sprawling leviathan of gray stone and jagged gargoyles that seemed to keep watch over the desolate moorland. It was a fortress of a house, ancient and imposing, with narrow windows that caught the dying light of the afternoon like cold, suspicious eyes. As the Duke stepped out and offered his hand, Lydia felt the sheer weight of the silence that governed the estate. It was a quiet so absolute it felt physical, pressing against her chest as she stepped onto the threshold of her new life. The great oak doors swung inward without a sound, revealing a foyer of black marble and towering shadows. There was no warmth to greet them, no crackling hearth or scent of dried lavender, only the smell of old wax and the sharp mineral tang of damp stone. The servants stood in a line of perfect, terrifying precision, their faces as unreadable as the portraits of the grim Ashcroft ancestors lining the gallery above. Lydia's mauve silk skirts, when now wrinkled from the long journey, felt loud and intrusive against the stillness of the hall. She realized then that this house did not just belong to Benedict Ashcroft. It was a physical extension of him. It was a place where emotions were checked at the gate and where secrets were buried beneath layers of polish and dust. Benedict did not look at her as he stripped off his leather gloves. "This house has been without a mistress for 20 years, he stated, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling with a lonely, hollow ring. It has grown used to its own company." He turned to her, his sharp features caught in the flicker of a single candelabra. "You will find that Coldstream does not welcome noise, Lady Lydia. But it offers a sanctuary that the gossiping streets of London cannot touch." As he gestured for the housekeeper to show her to her chambers, Lydia looked up the sweeping stone staircase. The shadows seemed to move in the corners of her vision, whispering of the many women who had surely withered in this cold magnificence before her. She was a bird flown from a burning nest into a gilded cage of ice, and as she climbed the stairs, she wondered if she would ever find the fire necessary to melt the heart of this house, or if she would simply become another silent ghost within its walls. The following morning, the oppressive silence of Coldstream Manor was broken not by a voice, but by the heavy clicking of a key in a lock. Benedict led Lydia to the northern wing, a part of the estate where the air felt even thinner, preserved in a layer of pristine, undisturbed dust. He pushed open a set of double doors to reveal a vast, circular gallery. The room was bathed in a singular, piercing light that flooded through a massive skylight, illuminating dozens of shrouded canvases and empty easels that stood like skeletons in the gloom. It was a space designed for creation, yet it had clearly been abandoned to the shadows for a generation. "My mother was a woman of many talents, though the house eventually drained them from her," Benedict said, his voice devoid of its usual sharp edge. He gestured to the north-facing windows, where the light was steady and true. "I am told that a painter requires a specific kind of clarity. Since you have traded your life for your father's debts, It seems only just that you have a sanctuary where you may forget the price you paid. He had noted the charcoal stains on her fingertips back at the Penhaligon gates, a detail most men of his station would have considered beneath their notice. Lydia stepped into the center of the room, her breath hitching as she saw a new set of brushes and oils laid out upon a pristine oak table. It was a staggering offering, not of affection, but of recognition. By granting her this gallery, Benedict was acknowledging that she possessed an inner world that he had no right to colonize. He was not looking for a decorative doll to sit at his table. He was providing the tools for her to remain herself within his walls. "You need not thank me," he added, intercepting the words before they could leave her lips. "This is a matter of logic. A mind without occupation is a mind that turns toward resentment, and I have no desire for a resentful wife." He turned to leave, his dark coat billowing like a shadow against the stark white light of the gallery. Lydia watched him go, realizing for the first time that while the Duke of Coldstream might never offer her his heart, he had offered her something she had never truly possessed in her father's house: his respect. The fragile peace of the morning was shattered by the arrival of a single, wax-sealed letter, its edges frayed as if it had been carried with trembling hands. It was delivered not to the Duke, but directly to Lydia as she sat in her newfound sanctuary of the gallery. The handwriting was unmistakable, the frantic, sloping script of her father. As she broke the seal, the smell of cheap ink and old tobacco wafted from the parchment, bringing with it the suffocating air of the life she thought she had escaped. The news was a hammer blow to her chest. Despite the Duke's gargantuan settlement, her father had defaulted once more, enticed by a sure bet that had vanished into the ether of a London gambling den. He was begging her, his dearest Duchess, to siphon a fraction of the Ashcroft fortune to quiet his new creditors before the bailiffs arrived. Lydia stood by the window, the letter crinkling in her grip. The very foundation of her marriage, the radical honesty Benedict had demanded, now felt like a trapdoor beneath her feet. She looked at the brushes and oils he had provided, the first tools of a freedom she had only begun to taste. If she helped her father in secret, she would be no better than the merchant she had feared. She would be a thief in her own home, building a life on a foundation of lies. Yet if she remained silent, the man who had raised her would be cast into the very cell she had sacrificed her liberty to prevent. The shadow of her father seemed to stretch across the marble floor, threatening to darken the clarity of the light Benedict had granted her. Her loyalty was no longer a simple matter of family blood. It was a choice between the past that had used her and the future that respected her. When the door opened and the Duke's steady footfall echoed in the room, Lydia did not hide the letter. She felt the heavy gold band on her finger, a shackle that had become a shield. She realized that to save her father again would be to lose herself forever. As Benedict approached, his gray eyes searching her face, Lydia made her choice. She held out the crumpled parchment, her hand steady. She would not be the bridge for her father's ruin to cross into this house. She would be the Duchess of Coldstream, even if the price was the final breaking of her heart. The iron carriage jolted over the rutted moorland road, its rhythmic swaying the only motion in a world that seemed to have turned to graystone and biting wind. Inside, the space was cramped, forcing a physical proximity that felt dangerous in the heavy silence. Lydia watched the Duke through the flickering shadows of the carriage lamps. Benedict sat with his head leaned back against the dark leather, his profile sharp and severe. Yet for the first time, he looked less like a monument and more like a man exhausted by the weight of his own armor. In the air between them was thick with the ghost of the letter she had handed him, the proof that she had chosen his honesty over her father's lies. "My mother did not die of a broken heart, Lady Lydia," Benedict said suddenly, his voice low and raspy, barely rising above the rattle of the wheels. He did not turn to look at her, but his hands tightened on the head of his silver cane. That is the romantic fiction the Tun prefers to whisper. She died of betrayal. He spoke of a father who had been the antithesis of the icicle, a man of vibrant passions and even more vibrant deceptions, who had squandered the Ashcroft dignity on a string of mistresses and false promises. Lydia listened, her breath held as the Duke unraveled the tapestry of his youth, a house filled with the sound of his mother's weeping and his father's empty, charming apologies. I watched love tear her apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a hollow shell and a silk dress, he continued, finally turning his gray eyes toward her. They were no longer like winter water. They were like smoke rising from a ruin. I vowed then that I would never be a man of feelings. I chose the ice because it does not shatter, it does not lie. The revelation hung in the small cabin, raw and bleeding. In that breach in his armor, Lydia saw the truth. His coldness wasn't a lack of soul, but a fortress built to protect one that had been wounded too deeply to ever trust the sun again. As the carriage plunged deeper into the night, she realized that they were both refugees of other people's sins, bound together not just by a debt, but by the shared knowledge of what it cost to survive. When the gallery was swallowed by the violet hues of twilight when Benedict finally returned, his presence announced only by the sharp, rhythmic click of his boots against the marble. He found Lydia standing before a canvas that was not a landscape, but a study of light hitting a block of ice, sharp, beautiful, and utterly solitary. The air in the room was brittle, still charged with the residue of his earlier confession in the carriage. Benedict stopped a few feet behind her, his shadow merging with the darkness of the corners. "You have been quiet since we returned," he noted, his voice regaining that polished, distant edge. "I trust the truth of my history has not made the air of Coldstream too heavy for you to breathe." Lydia did not turn around. She kept her eyes fixed on the painted ice, her heart beating with a sudden, reckless clarity. "You speak of honesty as if it were a gift, Benedict," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But I have come to realize it is actually your greatest deception." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. She turned then, her mauve skirts swishing like a challenge against the stillness. He was watching her, his expression a fortress of unreadable granite. "You use your truth like a shield," she continued, stepping into the space he usually kept guarded. "You tell me there is no love and no romance, not because you are cold, but because you are terrified. You are not an icicle by nature. You are a man hiding in a freezer so that no one can ever see the warmth you might possess. Oh, you aren't protecting me from your lack of affection. You are protecting yourself from the fear of being wanted." Benedict's jaw tightened, a single muscle leaping in his cheek. For a heartbeat, the mask of the Duke slipped, revealing a raw, startled vulnerability that mirrored the wounded boy he had once been. "You overstep, Lady Lydia," he rasped, though he did not move away. "I offered you a contract, not an invitation to dissect my soul." Lydia did not flinch. She reached out, her fingers grazing the dark wool of his sleeve, the very man who had once seemed untouchable. "A contract is for debtors," she whispered, "but a marriage, even one born in a garden of secrets, requires more than just a balanced ledger. It requires the courage to be seen." The cavernous dining room of Coldstream Manor was no longer an echo chamber of looming shadows and cold stone. Tonight a fire roared in the hearth, its amber light dancing across the silver candelabra and the heavy velvet curtains that shielded them from the biting moorland wind. Across the long mahogany table, Benedict Ashcroft watched Lydia with a gaze that had lost its clinical edge. The silence between them had shifted. It was no longer the oppressive quiet of two strangers bound by a debt, but a soft, expectant stillness. As the servants withdrew, leaving only the crackle of the logs to fill the space, Benedict set down his glass and leaned forward, the firelight catching the richness of his patterned waistcoat. "Your sisters," he began, his voice low and devoid of its usual command. "Tina, I am told the youngest has a fondness for botany. Does she share your spirit for the unconventional?" The question was simple, yet it felt monumental. For the first time, he was reaching across the ledger of their lives to acknowledge the people she had sacrificed herself to save. Lydia found herself speaking of her family not as a burden to be managed, but as a tapestry of lives she loved. She spoke of her dreams for the gallery, of the colors she wished to capture, and of a future where she was no longer a martyr at a gate. As she spoke, she watched the Duke's face. The fortress was still there, but the gates were open. When she recounted a particularly stubborn memory of her father's failed attempts at gardening, Benedict did not respond with a sharp observation or a cold decree. Instead, his lips twitched, and then, slowly, almost tentatively, they curved into a genuine smile. It was not the predatory smirk from the garden or the mocking curve of a man who held all the cards. It was a soft, human expression that transformed his sharp features, melting the icicle into a man who looked, for a fleeting moment, as though he might be happy. Lydia felt a strange, trembling edge of hope stir in her chest. The air was no longer sharp with the fear of being owned. It was heavy with the possibility of being understood. They were two broken legacies attempting to build something new from the ruins. As they sat in the warm glow of the room, Lydia realized that their life together would not be a business contract or a beautiful cage. It was a fragile beginning, a life she could finally shape with her own hands, beside a man who had finally found the courage to be seen.